There were two terminals that dropped out of the sky. They were actually, at that point, green screen terminals that just stuck out like a sore thumb to me. And I said to the folks we were working with, I said, what are those? And those were actually the automotive, their end customers' corporate systems were actually hardwired down into their plant because they needed specific data elements from the plant.
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our number one priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the WBS Podcast. I'm Sam Gupta, your host and principal consultant at digital transformation consulting firm Elevate IQ. Manufacturers have traditionally been problem solvers. While the problem-solving mindset helps create amazing products, the same skill fires back in designing the processes. This problem-solving approach leads each department to make their decisions independently and buy software to solve their problems, limiting interoperability. This approach also promotes the culture of organizational silos and prevents taking advantage of synergies through a consolidated view of the organization. In today's episode, we have our guest, Mike Yost, who discusses the differences between performance management, production management, and asset management on the shop floor. He also shares several stories where he improved the organization's performance by optimizing the shop floor functions and improving data sharing. Finally, he shares his insights into what executives can do to break the organizational silos and create a consolidated view to take advantage of synergies across business functions and plans. Let me introduce Mike to you. Mike Yost is the creator of Project IGBYS, co-founder of Bennett Incorporation. It's BENNIT Incorporation, and co-founder and host of the Industry 4.0 Club on Clubhouse. He has spent 30 years in industry working for large global corporations, technology startups, and industrial non-profits. He is specialized in smart manufacturing, MES, manufacturing intelligence, and operations management arenas since 1999 and is recognized globally as a thought leader in this space, including being a contributing expert to the 2017 and 2019 World Manufacturing Forum's reports on the future of manufacturing. With that, let's get to the conversation. Hey Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sam.
Of course, my pleasure. And just to kick things off, do you want to start with your personal story and current focus, Mike?
Absolutely. So appreciate being here. I've been involved in industrial automation, industrial software for nearly 30 years. And for me, it's about driving performance for manufacturers. And so, one of the stories that has really shaped my entire career that I'd like to share has to do with a manufacturer that was getting beaten by their competition because the traditional way for them doing business was to build to stock, and they would put a bunch of things into inventory, and then they had retailers that would buy from their inventory. And they were getting crushed because all of a sudden their competition was able to beat them and get products that are more tailored specifically to their needs. And so I was involved with a project, a team that was able to take their lead times from 63 days down to 9 days. And so that gave them a competitive advantage to compete against those other organizations that were moving faster than them. Also improve their service. The other thing they were able to do is they were able to take, there was over $27 million of finished goods they had in their warehousing that they were able to eliminate because they were able to more easily match production with demand.
Okay, amazing. So that's a very compelling statistics and data. We are going to dig deeper into all of that. But before we do that, we have one of the standard questions that we ask every single guest, and that is going to be your perspective on business growth.
Perfect. Appreciate it. Well, my perspective is that certainly the time that we're in right now, the ability to match the production with demand, right? To be able to understand where the markets are going and to be able to be responsive to them is critical. And we're seeing it in spades right now as we start to come out of the pandemic, and we're having shortages all over the place of materials and such, and people are rethinking their supply chains and such. And that story that I started with is many, many years old, but the principles still apply. Back then it was a pretty slow walk from recognizing that there was a business model that supported having 63-day lead time. Right nowadays, that's not really the case. You're getting triggers from the marketplace that are much more real time, much faster. You may be getting things, for example, feedback from social media, right? Where people are, where it used to be that a quality problem was something that was returned because it didn't meet specification. Nowadays, people use something, it was built properly to specification, but they just don't enjoy it. So they're on social media slamming your company, and your company picks up on that and has to be responsive to the marketplace. So it's a different trigger, but it still requires the same sort of responsiveness in manufacturing. And that's what I think from a growth perspective, the more opportunity that we have to sense where the market's going and more ability that we have in order to be responsive to those signals, that's where I think we have opportunity for growth.
Yeah, I completely agree with your assessment there. And this is the problem that I see with my customers as well. Having that deep understanding of the market as well as of the customers is crucially important, even though a lot of manufacturers might claim that they understand their customers and the space really well, but it's really hard for them, and they are not able to respond to the market conditions the way you described. So this understanding is absolutely critical. Now, let's go back to your story. And in that story, I'm actually trying to follow the story, to be honest. The data point that you mentioned related to reducing the lead time from your 63 days to 9 days, that's phenomenal. Okay. But when I follow the story, the manufacturer was more of the make to stock, which is going to be slightly more standardized processes. And my assumption is going to be that you probably converted them into slightly more tailored product if it's going to be make to order. And in my experience, the lead time is probably going to be higher because you have far more personal touch there from the sales process perspective, also from the engineering perspective. So what am I missing here? So from the make to stock, you went to make to order, and then you actually improved the lead time. So can you go one level deeper into the story? What kind of products were there with this manufacturer? What was the situation, and how did this lead time improve?
Excellent. Yeah, great question. And from my vantage point, I've grown up in the smart manufacturing is what we would call it today, but manufacturing execution systems, manufacturing intelligence, understanding what's happening actually in the production operations and what you do to control those areas. And so really, if you think about it, you're talking about building in lot sizes of, whatever lot sizes are required. So we didn't ourselves get into anything as far as rationalizing SKUs or changing the product mix or anything like that. We essentially just gave the manufacturer, and they were building industrial HVAC systems. So they were basically, we gave them the ability to manage the complexity in the manufacturing process itself based on whatever order was coming next. So instead of saying, we're setting up today and we're running 1,000 of these, instead it was, hey, here's the next one that is in the queue, and we would execute against that. So now when you get into things like inventory planning and things like that, that was a level above us, right? So as far as the planning and forecasting and things like that, that was a level above where we were. They were able to manage that and essentially send us down orders again, of any size. And we were able to manage the complexity, the work instructions, the quality tests, the traceability or quarantining of parts and things like that. It was an assembly process where, value was added to the products and the components as they moved down the line. And they were testing and things like that along the way. So it was just so we gave them the visibility and the control over all steps in the manufacturing process. And I think from a business perspective, we also gave them visibility into the data. So we were capturing product and process data in that throughout the process, providing that back to their enterprise systems, and they were able to handle their financials and their inventory and supplier management and those sorts of issues with the data that we were providing back to them.
Okay, so I'm still trying to understand this story. So you provided a lot of visibility. Maybe they did not have that visibility, but because of this visibility, what were the core reasons because of which the lead time was 63 days? Was this just the scheduling on the shop floor of different orders? And because of that, they were spending a lot of time in just collaborating when that collaboration was not necessarily needed. So you could optimize that, or were there problems in, let's say, when you started your job, you probably didn't have inventory and then you have to run around your shop floor and figure out where the job is. So what were the core challenges there?
Yeah, I think the core challenges, honestly, were more around a traditional business model, right? And so the model was we build this way. We have channels that are set up this way. We have buying agreements with our contractors and with our distributors and such, and this is just the way it is. And then when somebody took them to task and started to beat them at their game, they had to take a look at it from a overall business perspective and a survival perspective and say, what are we going to do? Because we're losing out at the point of purchase, right? So people are making decisions, and you get into buying something like an air conditioning system. There's not necessarily there's a handful of really good brands, and you trust any one of those, so it's hard to differentiate potentially one from the other. And if one's in stock, or you could have it in a week, or the other one's going to take you 2 months to get, well, you're going to take the one that's available in a week, right? So they did have to look at a lot of their business all the way around. I think when they did the analysis of that, of how they order, how they buy, how they sell, the overall logistics and all those points, they took a look at the manufacturing capabilities and said that they didn't have the capabilities to change in that domain, which is where we fit in. And we were able to give them the ability and say, we don't care what size order you want to run. Give us the order. We'll run one at a time, or we'll run 100 at a time, or we'll run 2 and then 12 and then another 2 and then another 100. So our fit was really in that as a complement to the business systems, right? That are managing these higher level balance sheets and financials and inventory and supplier management and all those other parts. There's a black hole that was the manufacturing domain. And, they had a way of throwing orders in there and getting a bunch of stuff out at particular quality levels and cost points and things like that. And so really they had the opportunity there to change the way they do that, because we were able to give them that type of responsiveness in their manufacturing operations.
Okay, amazing. So let's talk about the performance management and the asset management that you want to talk about. So I don't know how you differentiate that. What is going to be the difference in that? And if my listeners are not familiar with these 2 terms, or maybe 3 terms. So I think you mentioned the production management, then performance management, and then asset management. And all of that actually belongs to shop floor. And sometimes that could be very confusing for financial executives, because for them also, if you think about it, probably shop floor is going to be a kind of black hole the way the finance world is going to be for you guys. So break it down for my finance guys. If they want to understand how the production management differs from asset management and how the collaboration is going to happen between these 2 or 3 different processes, what kind of data elements are going to be exchanged, so you can pick up either a story or you can simply describe them, these 3 different areas.
Gotcha. Excellent. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, certainly, again, I'd go back probably to the earlier point about the way manufacturing has historically been done and more of how it's being done today, right? Manufacturing has historically been asset intensive or an asset driven business, right? So
Yeah.
we buy equipment. We use equipment for many, many, many years. We depreciate those assets. And so we want to get the most value out of those assets that we can. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, right? And so people put systems in. There's ways, especially nowadays with the Internet of Things and the industrial internet and digital manufacturing and such, that we're getting more and more capabilities to understand either existing assets that are in place that may have been built many, many years ago, or they may be new assets that people are buying, and they're coming with all sorts of sensors and all sorts of systems built into them to make them perform the best that they can, and those sorts of things. So managing the assets from that perspective is a great thing to do, right? And I think there's been a lot of focus in that domain. When you step back from that a second and say, well, if we're looking overall at how the plant's performing, there are a whole lot of other areas that we have to look at other than just the particular performance of that asset that we have. So there are things with the operators, right? There are things with materials. There are things with supplier quality. There are a lot of different variables to go into how the product flows through the plant and comes out the other side and ends up going out to the customers. And so if we step back from the individual asset level and take a look at a higher level, we can look at things more holistically at an area level, at a cell level, at a line level, or even at a business level. And so people will start to look from a performance management perspective and say, can we compare, plant to plant or business unit to business unit or products by different financial parameters or quality parameters or things like that. So there's been a lot of focus nowadays. And I think one of the original areas as people started to get their arms around the concept of the industrial internet, a lot of the focus was on the assets, right? It's the asset management piece. Right? So we will put more sensors on there. We will get more data out, and we will take these really expensive pieces of equipment and we will squeeze the most out of them, make sure that they're safe, make sure that they're creating good product for us. That will be the focus of where we're getting the value for our efforts. And I think you see nowadays that people are starting to broaden that conversation. It's not just right now, it's been going on for some time, but people are broadening that lens to say, let's look holistically at our processes, and inclusive of the assets that we're managing. Can we manage the overall performance across a number of different variables, like the workers, the labor, the products that we're making, and things like that?
Okay, so that's a very interesting perspective, and I'm actually going to ask you to go one level deeper into that as well. And if possible, how would this plant performance work? So let's say, initially you did mention that historically it was really, if you have a plant, then the performance is going to just belong to that. Maybe the parts, vendors, customers, whatever you have, probably they are going to belong to that specific plant, and then the other plant does not even know what is happening at the other plant. So you don't necessarily have let's say if you have any sort of volume discount from the vendors, you don't really have the centralized view of your inventory. You don't necessarily have the centralized view of your assets. So let's say if you were to compare the plant to plant performance, and if you were to design an ideal multi-plant manufacturing facility, what are some of the considerations that you will take while designing this? Would you, when you take the holistic picture, are you going to think that, okay, if I need in total 10 machines, okay, which vendor can I go for? If I need, let's say, 20,000 parts, where each of the parts belong, in which facility, where they are going to be manufactured? Are there going to be any synergies between the manufacturing facility? Are you going to consider things like, let's say, if I manufacture here, but then put it in the other plant because maybe that is near to your sourcing, so you might be able to save some shipping costs there. I don't know. I'm simply making things up, but are you going to consider all of that?
Well, I'm going to have a bunch of smart people around me that are going to consider all of those things as far as where we source products and put our facilities and such. Maybe I could just tie it to an example of a project that I was a part of years ago. And so I walked into a facility one time that was an automotive facility. They were building instrument panels. So everything you see in front of you when you're sitting in your car, with the exception of the steering wheel. And when I walked in, there were 24 stations in the line. It was dedicated purpose. So this plant was just building these products. There were very many different combinations that could be put in, different radios and different steering columns and things like that, different colors obviously. But it was this whole plant was doing nothing but building these instrument panels. Yeah. There were two terminals that dropped out of the sky and were plugged into, they were actually at that point green screen terminals that just stuck out like a sore thumb to me. And I said to the folks we were working with, I said, well, what are those? And those were actually the automotive, their end customers' corporate systems were actually hardwired down into their plant because they needed specific data elements from the plant. So anytime they needed for the National Transportation Safety Board, they needed to have confirmation that there were 4 successful torques on the steering column before that product could be released, right? So that had to be captured by law. And then there was another, recall or traceability type of data element that was required that they wanted. So they knew as a manufacturer that they needed these data elements from their suppliers. So they physically bore into their plants and got the data and pulled it out for their use. Now, so those are considerations, right? That you're going to need that type of information off of your plant floor. And I think that's important for people to understand, what do we need in order to make some of the decisions that you were talking about before, like where we build, what's most effective, and, how do we adjust and things like that. But what that did not do, and what we did with the system that we put in place, was that did not help the workers that were building the instrument panels one bit. So they didn't help them balance work content. It didn't help them understand the standard work to be done. It didn't help them improve their performance, drive quality, decrease costs or anything like that. So by putting systems in place at the plant level directly, and it was a very similar type of system to the one I mentioned previously, not only could we manage the work itself, we were able to give the data that was required in the process to the corporate entity and say, here's your test results, or here's your traceability information, as well as a whole bunch of other information around the worker performance and the suppliers, incoming quality, outgoing quality, those sorts of things. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I mean, to me, it screams out the point that you need to understand your touch points into the manufacturing domain as one of a very critical element. And then have a way to feed that information, tie it in with the flow of your business operations overall to help you make informed decisions along the line like you were talking about.
Yeah, interesting. Definitely very interesting story there. And there are a lot of things to learn from that story. But I am actually going to ask this question in a different fashion from the manufacturing perspective, right? So let's say if I'm the manufacturing CFO, and I have 2 different manufacturing sites, and I sort of know that I don't necessarily know as much about my business as I could or should. Okay. And I am trying to get that cross-functional visibility across my plants, across my divisions, across my departments. I am trying to get the consolidated view. So what will be the process to start in this journey? Let's say if my plants are operating independently right now, and I know in my heart that there are going to be some synergies and there are going to be some cost saving opportunities that I may be able to utilize if I actually took a holistic picture of my company as opposed to thinking it as individual manufacturing sites. So what will be your advice or approach for this executive? How can he or she start on the journey of getting this consolidated view?
Yeah. First of all, you're talking about the right place. You have to start with the strategic buy-in from the leadership, because the way systems are bought today in the plants, they're historically have been bought by the departments, right? So the quality department needs a system, the maintenance department needs something, production needs something, and those end up in silos doing whatever job they were purchased to do, and they don't necessarily connect with each other. And so interoperability becomes a huge issue. You may also acquire a plant. That second plant that you're talking about might be an acquisition, right? And so it's running on a completely different set of infrastructure than the first plant. So, first and foremost, it is about getting buy-in and providing executive leadership, right? Working across boundaries, so across those different departments, and partnering up with your manufacturing leadership, partnering up with your probably your CIO or your IT leadership, and saying, how do we go about this, and finding partners that you can trust that have the ability to help manage those types of programs. Because the actual connection to the plant floor stuff, to get data off the plant floor, isn't hard. To get it and have it a way that it's meaningful and that it's repeatable and it's safe and secure and all those sort of things, that takes some more work. So you need to have partners that you can trust, and they're out there. There are folks that you can work with and help guide you through the process. And if you're committed to it, and I'd say probably most importantly, committed to the people that are going to be impacted, because one of the things I know will happen for sure is there will be, if you put systems in place to monitor, like all of a sudden, if there's a system that's put in place to monitor performance where there hadn't been a system before, there's going to be immediate resistance to say, why are you watching me? Right? Yeah. Like, what Big Brother's watching, I'm not comfortable with this. So a lot of successful organizations will look at how they engage their workers, how they compensate people, how they share information about performance, how they, the workers themselves can use the information that's being gathered to help impact their own performance and their job performance and their future pay raises and all sorts of things like that. And if the company's coming at it from that perspective, technology becomes sort of the third leg of the stool, okay, behind the people and the process. Then I think you can find the tech solutions that work, and they may end up being different based on the type of industry you're in. If somebody's brewing beer, or maybe you're doing beer in one plant and you're making food in another plant, different types of processes versus the environments I was talking about earlier, making automotive parts and making air conditioners. It's a very assembly oriented type of environment. So there are different vendors with different expertise in those areas. But at the bottom line is there are people that have solutions, have experience, have expertise that can help. But it's got to be driven by a commitment to, and a definition around, like you said, what are we looking to get out of this? How are we going to use the information? Those sorts.
Yeah. So interesting story again. I think this has to be a comprehensive approach. Could not agree more that it has to be the people, process, and technology. And you are absolutely right about your comment that traditionally majority of the manufacturing corporations, they bought the systems at the department level. In fact, as of today, just because it's just easier, you don't have to go through the politics, I guess. It's just hard. The organization has always been very siloed, and it's always going to be easier to make decisions in those departments. But obviously, if you want to go cross-functional, that requires a dramatic change in the organization, which is typically harder. But let's go back to your comment about the interoperability of different systems, and when you have the siloed system, why is that so hard? You are talking about one system to the next. So let's say if I'm the financial executive and if I'm thinking, okay, it's just a piece of software, why is it so hard for these two systems to be able to talk to each other?
Okay, so if we can take a few hours here, I can give you the whole laydown on that. To me, simply stated, I really think, because I personally grew up with software in manufacturing. I started in the early 90s, and we had basically Microsoft Windows was not yet on the plant floor. Where it was not working well. There were business leaders in manufacturing companies that said, Microsoft will never be on our shop floor back in those days. And obviously that's not true today, right? So we went from a phase or an age of saying, hey, we're different, we're manufacturers, what we do here is serious. It's real time, mission critical. People's lives are at stake, so we can't have blue screens of death and database leaks and all that other kind of stuff, which happened with some of those technologies at that time.
Yeah.
But we went from sort of that mindset of saying we're digging our heels in and saying we're not going to adopt that stuff to a point where the technology far outpaced our mindset, and it's capable on a level that we don't even understand, right? That we can't keep up with. And so I think when you take a look at the types of systems that are created in the plants to control assets, right? They're created for control. They're created for safety, orderly shutdown, high-speed decisions, determinism, right? Sub-millisecond type of responses. They weren't created with any sort of context around a business item, right? So translating the sort of the bits and bytes of what's happening in process into something that has context, has meaning that you would understand, not only on a financial level, but even from like a plant order level. Like I know I'm making this part, or I know this operator is working on it, or things like that. That's not what they were built for. And I think to the point about the evolution of technology, a lot of the technologies that are applied and being applied nowadays didn't necessarily start in manufacturing. And so you ended up with a bunch of problem-solving manufacturers, right? And that's what manufacturers are, right? They're problem solvers. So they solve problems with the tools they have available to them. And then when you go to the other part of the plant, they're solving problems their way. And you have, I've lived through a real divide between sort of the plant level and the enterprise level organizations. And that, used to be hard to connect the two worlds together. Now it's not so hard from a technology perspective, but it's still hard from that context perspective, that communications perspective, and even in a lot of cases from a interpersonal, like the way the departments work with each other, and just how the business is run from an ops perspective. Oftentimes there's still a lot of rub between enterprise level leaders and the plant level folks. So is it getting better? Yeah, it is. Should it be easier, more interoperability? Absolutely. There are organizations right now that are working on standards, that are working on initiatives to address these issues around data context, data systems interoperability and things like that. So that stuff will come. But today, in the meantime, we're still out there solving problems using whatever technologies that we have available to us, which ends up creating some of these challenges of getting the data that we need to do the higher level business functions.
Yeah, so I think you have some really, really interesting insight there, and I want to make sure that the listeners are able to visualize that. So let's say if we were to take an example of this data translation problem, you did mention that the plant is going to speak completely different language and my enterprise is speaking completely different language. And you did mention that, at the order level, the information is going to be, the way information is going to be structured is probably going to be completely different. So are you able to provide any sort of examples in terms of what kind of differences are we talking about? How is this information going to be structured? Do you have any examples in terms of this differences of the structuring of this data at the plant level versus the enterprise level?
I know from my time working with manufacturers, with the way like a large ERP system is set up, right? There are specific tables and formats, and there's ways that you plug into those tables to provide the information that those systems work against. So those systems have their definition of what financials mean, or how you define an order, or how you define materials, or things like that. And they're very specific to that type of system that you have. And the plant floor systems don't do that at all. I mean, so if you're down at the control level, I mean, you're talking about the actual process, and it is in something like ladder logic, right? Which is just the inputs and outputs and cycle times and things like that. There are systems that will receive an order, and not even all systems have to, on the plant floor, really care about what it is that is being produced. So they're basically just running against a specification that is defined, and without any real, context around, the translation of that. So are you familiar with, or would the audience be familiar with the Purdue model?
A little bit. the majority of the listeners are going to be finance executives, right? So they are not necessarily familiar with Purdue model because that's slightly more from the enterprise architecture perspective or from the system perspective, or maybe from the plant architecture perspective.
10 seconds or less. I mean, it just defines that there are different layers from a real-time operations control perspective to an information level to a higher level operations management level to the business level. And each one of those areas has its own language. And even within those areas, the systems that exist within there tend to have their own languages. And so when you have any number of different systems that are crossing into those different layers, you get into that interoperability challenge, that translation issue. And one of the things that's hopeful about the industrial internet and where we are going nowadays is that talking about those layers going away, right? Like now I can just have information coming straight off of the plant floor and skipping the process of going through all of those layers. And I guess it's sort of like my analogy that I mentioned earlier about the green screen terminals. Just basically plugging down and grabbing the data that we need and pulling it out. So as you get IoT sensors and things like that are now able to be dropped in, if you can drop those in with the context that you need to pull the information out, then those should be getting easier to do. But again, I think it still ends up being tailored to the manufacturer themselves versus buying stuff off the shelf, buying assets from equipment builders or buying MES systems or whatever it is that you're buying. They're going to end up being tailored to the specific work processes and business processes of the manufacturer.
All right, Mike, that's it for today. Do you have any last minute closing thoughts by any chance?
Sure. I would say that have these conversations with your business. There's significant value in having access, visibility, like we've been talking about here today, to have your financial systems run on real, actionable, contextualized information to give you the type of responsiveness and visibility that we've talked about here. And it's not going to happen without a commitment from the leadership to say, we have a vision for where we're going for this, and we're going to figure out together how to work through all of the individual challenges. So I'd say it's worth it, and start the conversations with your leadership team, because again, I think it's absolutely worth it. And there are people out there that are doing it and have a lot of experience that can help.
Okay, amazing. And my personal takeaway from the conversation is going to be build that cross-functional and the comprehensive view of the organization. Whether you have 4 walls or 16 walls, you definitely need to have that comprehensive view. So on that note, Mike, I would like to thank you for your time. This has been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Sam. I appreciate it.
I cannot thank our guests enough for coming on the show, for sharing their knowledge and journey. I always pick up learnings from our guests, and hopefully you learned something new today. If you want to learn more about Mike, head over to projectigbys.com. It's projectigbys.com. And engage in Project IGBYS to shape a new model for knowledge capture and sharing at scale. Links and more information will also be available in the show notes. If anything in this podcast resonated with you and your business, you might want to check other related episodes, including the interview with Martin Cloak, who discusses different barriers associated with artificial intelligence and Industry 4.0 adoption. Also, the interview with Mike Nager, who discusses the organizational metrics and KPIs that completely ignore the cost savings opportunities available through control and policies. Also, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word among folks with similar backgrounds. If you have any questions or comments about the show, please review and rate us on your favorite podcasting platform or DM me on any social channels. I'll try my best to respond personally and make sure you get help. Thank you, and I hope to catch you on the next episode of the WBS Podcast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.